And so it seemed very appropriate that an individual that I interviewed many years ago, actually 6 years ago when his book came out, Did America Have a Christian Founding?, would be good to bring him back to the microphone. We had him in studio back then, and since then, of course, he has gone on to certainly very significant places to have an influence, including Regent University's Robertson School of Government. He's also the director of religious liberty there. Graduate of Wheaton College, has his PhD in government from the University of Virginia. And as we mentioned just a while back when we had Kelly Shackelford in here, he was invited to actually speak at the first National Religious Liberty Commission that was held. Many of them have been held since then. And so, Mark David Hall, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby.
It was great to see you back many years ago. You were at George Fox at the time. The book had just come out. And I might just mention that the reason the book came out was because you had done this very significant speech that took place at the Heritage Foundation that had the title, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And that resulted in, I think, 300,000 downloads and more of the speech. And as a result, is the reason that you wrote the book.
No, that's exactly right. And I was shocked to learn that figure because we're talking about literal downloads as opposed to just clicks, someone who looks at it and goes on. And so those numbers were allowed me to convince Nelson Books that this was a book that would be of interest to a broad audience. Most of my works before that one had been aimed at academic audiences, and I think they're good and useful books, but they never would sell more than 1,000 copies, whereas this one was intended for the general reading public. Anyone who likes to read, anyone interested in these sorts of questions can pick it up, and it's hopefully very accessible.
Quite readable.
Any level of education.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And I might just mention that we do have a link to your website, markdavidhall.org. You'll see where Glenn Beck and Eric Metaxas and Ben Shapiro, and you go all the way down. Oh, even Kerby Anderson has a comment there as well. But more importantly, when the book first came out, the first few comments came from people like Kelly Shackelford and Daniel Dreisbach and Marvin Olasky, all people we have on the program with some regularity. And I just think it illustrates again that this is an ongoing question, and perhaps even more so here in 2026, don't you think?
I think so, exactly. Yeah, we're obviously celebrating the nation's 250th birthday, and there's two ways we could go. One direction, the 1619 Project, America is a horrible failed experiment in racism and sexism and militarism and so forth, and I think we would have gone in that direction had we had a Harris presidency. Unfortunately, with the Trump presidency, at least at the national level, to the extent to which the government's involved, we have recognition. America is not a perfect place, but it's a very, very good place. And because of our founding and the principles of our founding, really all Americans, Christians or not, have benefited tremendously. And so I've been very heartened to see the sort of America at 250 celebrations that are being planned, that at least the ones I'm aware of.
Let me just mention we're in this hour going to go through a number of things. We're going to look at a couple of the myths in just a few minutes that are used to argue against that premise of did America have a Christian founding. We're going to focus a fair amount of time, obviously, on the First Amendment, religious liberty. But even before we get to that, in the column that I wrote about your piece years ago, and then I wrote a more recent one here as well, you help us kind of think through this issue of how to think about whether or not you have a Christian founding, in which you have many founders were actually identifying themselves as Christians. Then you have others that I think we can honestly say from their writings, can we agree they were Orthodox Christians? But then you have others that maybe acted like it, and in some way or another certainly agreed with some of the principles that are elicited in not only your book, but in the Declaration and the Constitution, and then others were influenced. And so sometimes when you say, is this a Christian nation, it's confusing because until you define your terms, as you do so accurately, some people can immediately say yes or no without understanding kind of the nuance. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, so this is what I address in the very first chapter of the book, the introduction. What do we mean by a Christian founding? And I lay out a couple of possibilities, some of which you just mentioned. If we could go back in time and ask the founders, what religion are you? I think it's just almost without debate that every single one of them would have said, I am a Baptist, I am an Anglican, I'm a Congregationalist, I am some stripe of Christians. even those we know that in their heart of hearts rejected Orthodox Christianity probably would have said something like that. But that's not a very interesting finding, right? They might not have been well-read Christians. They might not have been serious Christians. They might not have been Christians, or they might have been Christians wanting to create a secular commonwealth. And so I then go on to consider, okay, well, are they Orthodox Christians? And there we have every reason to believe that many of them would fit that category. We know a few would not, a handful would not. And they're important founders. That Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams were not Orthodox Christians, even though they still would have identified themselves as one. But even that's not so interesting. So just to jump to the conclusion, I ask, were America's founders influenced by Christian ideas, or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection? And there the answer is an unambiguous yes. I think with beyond a shadow of a doubt, we can argue that America had a Christian founding if we define it in that way. And that's perhaps the most significant way, right? I'd much rather have someone, let's say a James Madison, who is very private about his religious beliefs. I would hesitate to label him. And yet in Federalist 51, just for instance, he said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. But men aren't angels, and therefore we need government, we need separation of powers, we need checks and balances. And so there I think we see an influence of the Christian idea that humans are sinful, and that even Christians struggle with the old man within, and that this conviction led to some very concrete aspects of America's Constitution.
And again, what you find, especially with James Madison, and I'll hold up the booklet that I did a couple of months ago on a biblical view on the Federalist Papers, is that, it has some Calvinist ideas studied under Witherspoon. You can't read at least a few of the Federalist Papers, and I'll point you to Federalist Paper number 10, maybe Federalist Paper number 51, which you just mentioned, which were both written by James Madison, that even if you say, look, I can't read all the Federalist Papers, I bet you could read one or two. And if you do, you're going to say he's pretty much talking like a Christian, where he stood in terms of all the other theological doctrines we can set aside. But in terms of understanding that we have a need for countervailing ambitions, we need for checks and balances, because we believe that human beings are not angels, that they have a sin nature. He doesn't use that phrase, but he certainly implies that. I think illustrates at least one of the points. But Mark, if we can for just a minute, let's maybe focus on some of the myths. And the first one is, are the founders deists? Now, it's quite clear that there is a short list of those who would accept deism, the idea that God started the universe but backed away and was not involved in the day-to-day activities. My quick answer sometimes, if I get that question when I'm out speaking, is to say, well, if you look at some of the times in which we had the various congresses gather together, before they would consider anything, they would spend sometimes all day, but certainly all morning in prayer. Those are pretty dedicated deists praying all morning. But you have obviously looked at that and recognized that there are some civic leaders who publicly embrace deism. But then as soon as you do so, the next piece is, well, aren't there any others? Because, it's a short list, isn't it?
It's a very short list. In fact, I would say there are two founders that are deists, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, of course, is from England and only spends about 20 years of his life in America, so I'm not even sure we should count him as an American. Now, if we go beyond those two to a Jefferson, a Franklin, a John Adams, I'm sorry to say they were not Orthodox Christians, but all of them spoke, even with some regularity, about God intervening in human affairs, in the affairs of men and nations. And so by the regular definition that most of us have, they wouldn't be deists. Now, someone like a Thomas Jefferson maybe was just doing that for rhetorical effect, and I'm open to that argument. But even so, it's hard to get to the fingers on one hand if we want to list the civic leaders in the American founding who were deists, almost non-existent.
One of the things that you do is actually give us some quotes, and I'll pick Gordon Wood as one. The founding fathers were at most deists. They believed God created the world and left it alone to run. And I think it illustrates the fact that if you're not looking at that from a Christian point of view, you might say, well, that was the prevailing philosophy, Enlightenment deism. And if you haven't taken the time to dig into some of the writings, you would just naturally conclude that. One of the individuals that sometimes gets listed as a deist, you mentioned, is Benjamin Rush. if you've taken any time at all to read Benjamin Rush, you can't even possibly come to that conclusion. And when you start thinking about some of the others who were very much involved in what today we call the Sunday school movement, the Bible movement, they certainly talked about the importance of prayer, God's movement in history. It, I think, illustrates the fact that we all come to history with a set of blinders, with a worldview. And sometimes because you're a Christian, you maybe see some things that other, say, non-Christian historians don't see. Is that fair?
I'd like to think that's the case. George Marsden, the great church historian, spoke about the possibility of having an insider's perspective, where, say, a Christian historian or a Christian student of history might pick up on things that others don't. Let me give you a great example of that. I think it was a great historian, Ed Morgan, who said, in effect, that there's no evidence that George Washington ever read the Bible, much less quoted the Bible. And yet Washington does that all the time. He quotes Micah 4:4 alone more than 40 times. The problem is he doesn't put in the citation. He doesn't put in Micah 4:4.
Right.
And so if you're biblically illiterate, and Ed Morgan was a brilliant man, but he didn't know his Bible well, you could read right over these references to Micah 4:4 and not recognize them as being biblical, and then make that sort of claim in good faith. I think he was acting in good faith, but he was just dead wrong, as my friend Daniel Dreisbach has shown in reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. Washington, and it wasn't just Micah 4:4, he cites hundreds of scriptures throughout all sorts of writings, public and private, and I think that's important. If he only cited the Bible, if he only quoted or referenced the Bible in major public speeches, one might argue he's just doing it for rhetorical effect. But when he does it in a private letter, in a journal, or that sort of thing, I think it shows, first of all, that he knew the Bible very, very well, and second of all, that he took it seriously and that he quoted it for effect and not just not for rhetorical purposes.
You see that also in terms of the fact, and I can hold up one of our booklets that we've done, and that it relates to the Patriot Preachers, because if you aren't familiar with some of the statements that were made at the time and recognize that some of those statements in the correspondence that went back and forth between the founders and the framers, you wouldn't recognize that those quotes actually came from sermons of the day. And so again, because in some cases they didn't have a Bible verse next to it, there wasn't any need, because a lot of people were familiar with some of those Bible verses. And so as a result, we would even this day quote certain passages of Scripture and not put a footnote next to it, or not even put more than, if we were verbally communicating that, anything, even a Scripture reference, because everybody knows John 3:16 or a variety of other passages. And so in some respects, it's easy to have missed that if you're not looking at some of the history from a Christian point of view. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. There's a letter I quote from in the book. Ben Franklin, he's going to republish something that was published in America. He's going to republish it in England. And he's explained to the author, or to a correspondent, I think it is, that basically when this was published in America, there was no need to include the biblical citations because everyone would pick up on them. But now that he's publishing it in England, he's going to include the biblical citations so people know what they're reading. And it just goes to what I think my friend Daniel showed in really beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Americans in the founding era knew their Bible inside and out. And I'm not just talking about college-educated Americans. People like Roger Sherman, who never went to college, and many of the other civic leaders who might not have Harvard and Yale degrees. If they knew anything, they knew the Bible, and they knew it very, very well. And they referenced it. They used it in their arguments. They used it in policy debates. So the Bible was the most influential book by far. I'll mention real quickly the study that's been dated, and it could be done far better now, Donald Lutz of the University of Texas, where he goes through basically a representative sample of political writings and finds that the authors of these political writings cite the Bible far more than they cite all Enlightenment authors combined. So you put together Montesquieu, John Locke, Beccaria, Adam Smith, and the Bible is cited far more than all these guys combined. And I think if we were to redo this study today, which we could do far better with I hate to say it, but ChatGPT or something like that, and all the stuff that's been digitized, I think we'd find the Bible was cited actually a far more percentage, because you could get beyond citations and look at actual references without those citations. And when we do that, I think we'll find the Bible is absolutely the dominant text in the American founding.
One of the books I have on my shelf is by Donald Lutz, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. One of my major professors at Georgetown had worked with them and some other people at the University of Houston, LSU, and other places. And that is, I think, just again, some great documentation for the fact that if you were willing to look at this from maybe a little more objective point of view, or even begin to use your Christian worldview to understand what we are talking about today, this would be, I think, very helpful. We're going to come back and pick off just another one of those myths in just a minute, and that is, does the United States have basically a godless constitution? Because that was an argument being made. My argument, very quickly, but we'll certainly hear from Mark David Hall, is that if you think about this, the Declaration is sort of telling you the why for the American government experience, and the Constitution is telling the how. Now, there's a couple of places where we obviously can see certainly an understanding of theism and God in the Constitution, but the focus there was in some respects to talk about how it should be constructed. And then, of course, if you read the Federalist Papers, which in some respects are the commentary on the Constitution, you would then expect some of those kinds of comments to surface. Just as I sometimes say that if you were today to talk about a church, if you read through maybe the church constitution, you'd say, doesn't even look that Christian. But if you read the doctrinal statement, you would say, well, of course it's Christian. In some respects, the Declaration provides you with a perspective of the why of the American government. The Constitution is the how. And so then you'd say, well, then how would I understand that? Well, that's why we talk about the Federalist Papers, just like having a commentary on your Bible. We'll come back and pick off at least one more of those myths.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode.
If you'd like to know more about him or the book, we have lots of information on our website. And I thought, David, for a few minutes, we might focus on this issue of the United States. Does it have a godless constitution? 30 years ago, two individuals wrote a book called The Godless Constitution, The Case Against Religious Correctness. You have others, The Myths America Lives By. You have The Free Thinkers, A History of American Secularism. The list goes on, and there has been an argument that as I look through the Constitution, I don't see a lot of evidence of any Christian influence. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And I'll point out the book, The Godless Constitution, was written by two Cornell professors. And this is one of the disappointing things. A lot of this literature, some of it's written by angry polemicists who work for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, but some of it's written by professors who should know better, including professors at Christian colleges. And they oftentimes make really bad arguments. So, for instance, when they look at the Declaration, they'll see references to God, to nature's God, to the Creator, to providence, and they'll say, oh, this is just window dressing. These are irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And then we go to the Constitution, they'll say, oh, it's incredibly significant that the deity isn't mentioned at all, except in the date line in the year of our Lord, 1787. And because there are not references to God or Jesus Christ, it's not a Christian document. And I think both of those arguments are just silly. I think the key thing is to look at the ideas underlying the Declaration and the ideas underlying the Constitution. And as I point out in the book, I think you can make excellent arguments that the founders were profoundly motivated by Christian ideas. I already mentioned that the notion that humans are sinful and that even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within, which leads us to limited power, enumerated powers, Article 1, Section 8, checks and balances, and this sort of thing. And that's just one example. I give a couple of other examples. I think one of the most important ones, and I flesh this out in a follow-up volume, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, is the idea, the conviction that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, And the implications for this are just dramatic. It means we're rational creatures, we're capable of governing ourselves, but most importantly, it means that all humans should be treated with respect and dignity, men and women, Caucasians, African Americans, Native Americans. And if you look throughout American history, you can see that we never arrived at the moment of perfection, but we've been moving in that way in very important ways, right? Getting rid of slavery, getting rid of Jim Crow legislation, and that almost always leading advocates of these moves are Christians drawing on their Christian convictions that I think are very well articulated in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Think about that. Created equal. That's a theological claim, and it's a theological claim with profound implications for law and public policy.
What about this idea of window dressing? Because in some respects, God was referred to as the divine author or providence, and if you don't necessarily the God of the Old Testament, they then dismiss that. But I think one place you made the argument that using that logic, you could say, well, then the Lord's Prayer is not Christian because it refers to our Father. And so there's a sense in which you have to understand that there are some idioms. I run into people sometimes that say the good Lord, and that's not the way I would say it, not the way you would say it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe in God. And I think there's a sense in which maybe there is an attempt to actually remove even some of the most religious ideas from the text. And so that's an important issue. But let me just take one other one that you have addressed before. That is, we do have the Constitution saying there should be no religious test for office. Now, again, you and Daniel Dreisbach and others have explained what that was all about. But because we had state churches, sometimes a religious test could be used to prevent a person who is a Christian from being able to serve in office because they're not Anglican, congregational, or congregational, I should say, or Baptist, whatever it might be. And in some respects, our secular friends today are saying that there no religious tests illustrates that they wanted the Constitution to be secular. But that's not what was intended, was it?
No, I don't think so at all. And at the time, you do have religious tests in something like 11 of the 13 states. These tests often just required that someone be a theist, occasionally that you had to be a Protestant or a theist who believes in the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament. But there is a move away from these religious tests, and there are debates over these religious tests, and there are debates that I think ought to be taken seriously. One argument was these religious tests don't work because if I'm a bad man, if I'm an atheist who's bad, I won't hesitate to say, yeah, sure, I believe in God, let me to office, right? So they don't actually keep bad people out of office, and then they might keep good people out of office. If your test is you have to be an Anglican, there might be one of the best people in the state to be governor might be a Presbyterian, and you're excluding him from that office, and that's not a good idea. Most broadly, and I would make this argument today, if I'm going to vote in my local congressional election and I have a chance to vote for someone who's Jewish and pro-life and fiscally responsible, and his opponent was someone who calls himself a Christian but is pro-choice and is fiscally irresponsible, I would vote for the candidate who's Jewish in a heartbeat. It wouldn't even be a question in my mind. And so, one could ask, really, how important is it that the candidate, that the elected officials share my religious particularities or convictions? Now, all things being equal, I guess I would prefer to have Orthodox Christians in office to atheists, say. And yet I think one can make very good arguments that religious tests don't get at the sort of outcomes that we as Christians actually want to see with respect to our elected officials.
Well, while we're talking about religion, a good portion of your book is about religious liberty, and you're the director of religious liberty in the states, of course. And this brings us to the booklet I'll hold up now, the one we did on church state, because, again, a lot of our secular friends say, well, no religious test. And really, then when you get to the First Amendment and Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, which later Justice Hugo Black used to argue that there should be a wall of separation, we today run into people all the time who are actually against religious liberty because they say there should be a separation of church and state. How do you respond?
Yeah, so what I do in the book is I separate the pre-exercise clause from the establishment clause, and I show that by the time we get to the founding, there is a robust conviction that religious liberty must be protected whenever possible. and that religious liberty includes far more than the freedom of belief and worship. It includes our ability to act upon our religious convictions whenever possible. Now, of course, this can't be an unlimited right. If you have someone who sincerely believes that he has to sacrifice a baby to the sun god, we're going to say, no, you don't get to do that, and step in and keep him from doing that. But religious liberty for all Americans must be robustly protected. On the flip side, we have the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, clearly applying just to the national government until it was applied later in the 20th century to the states through the 14th Amendment. And here we have, indeed, people from the Freedom from Religion Foundation and ACLU arguing that this clause requires a wall of separation between church and state. And one of the things I hope I do very effectively, is demolish that claim and to argue that, in fact, the Establishment Clause pretty much does what it says, or it was meant to do what it says, that we are not going to have an established church. We are not going to have a Church of the United States. And now, by extension, we aren't going to have a Church of Texas or Church of Virginia. But that's pretty much all the Establishment Clause prohibits. And so lots of other things are constitutionally permissible. To take an issue that's bubbling around right now in the courts, can a state like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana pass a law requiring posters of the Ten Commandments to be on public school classrooms? I think indisputably that's constitutionally permissible for this sort of law to go into effect. And yet we have our friends, or maybe enemies sometimes, of the ACLU and so forth saying, no, you can't do that. That violates the Establishment Clause. Well, in no way, shape, or form does it violate the original understanding of the Establishment Clause or the history and tradition of what Americans have done, really, from the early colonies to the present day.
And in Chapter 4, of course, you have a whole section on the founders believe civic authorities should promote and protect and even encourage religion and morality. But also, I might mention your other book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, How Christianity has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans, because in some respects, Mark, this is the so what question. Sometimes when I've spoken on the booklet that I have, we have a whole presentation on One Nation Under God based on the title of that book. And when I've spoken on other aspects of the Constitution or the Federalist Papers or the Patriot Preachers or Church and State, oftentimes at the end people say, well, that's great. That's what it was maybe in the 18th century, but we're in the 21st century, and most people don't care anymore. And we have all sorts of secular ideas. But really what you are trying to do is help us understand that it isn't just an issue of historical significance. If we really want to promote freedom and equality, and we have something that leads to a tremendous amount of thriving in America, Christianity has been the source of that, and that's why some of the changes that have taken place in the last couple of decades and move us towards greater religious liberty is a net positive for America, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the objections I oftentimes would get, and it's like the knockout objection. Well, the founders didn't immediately abolish slavery, so therefore we didn't have a Christian founding. And so part of what I do in the second book, the follow-up book, is push back against that and say, well, actually, American Christians were pushing back against slavery early in the 18th century, in some cases before that. By the time you get to the founding era, they are pushing back really hard against slavery. Slavery is abolished or put on the road to extinction in 8 states. Most people forget about that long before the Reconstruction Amendments. You have the Northwest Ordinance that bans the expansion of slavery into the Old Northwest, so that territory that became Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and so forth. And then you have the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. So Christians motivated by their faith to oppose this political evil, this moral evil, and that's a good thing. And then you could keep going with the story into the 20th century. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and so forth and so on, Christian leaders being inspired by their faith to oppose Jim Crow legislation. And I highlight these things, but I talk about others, evangelical opposition to the removal of Native Americans from land they had rights to in Georgia, and so forth. Now, of course, you can always respond, yeah, but some Christians look to the Bible to defend slavery, and I can agree with that, in the same way that today you can point to people who claim to be Christians who point to the Bible or who use the Bible to defend abortion, and I would simply say, yeah, some people claim to be Christians did that sort of thing, but they were wrong. And in fact, the biblical view on slavery, on abortion, is really quite clear if you bother to look. And it's entirely appropriate for Christians to get involved in political activity to oppose these great moral evils. We've done this with great success with respect to slavery and Jim Crow legislation, with some success with respect to abortion. But we need more Christians to enter the political arena to continue fighting this grave moral evil.
Let's also pick up just one thing real quickly that I have talked about before. And the other day, I saw a clip where, for the first time, Glenn Beck says, I did not know this, but the original draft of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence actually had an anti-slavery passage. Now, it was removed because of some of the southern colonies, but I think that's just one of those pieces of history which, if as person as learned as, say, Glenn Beck or others hadn't heard, it's worth mentioning right now, and just illustrating again that the abolition movement was in full force even in the early and middle parts of the 18th century. By the time we get to Constitution, they tried to do what they could to get rid of that, and in some respects we can wish that maybe they had. But as you point out, if you are looking for the kind of social movements that have made a significant impact in America, almost always they were Bible-based. The abolition movement, the suffrage movement, the temperance movement, the civil rights movement, one after another, those came from Bible-believing Christians. Yes, some people misinterpreted the Bible. I suspect people, even to this day, are misinterpreting the Bible sometimes. But I think it's an illustration that, if anything, the point you make in your books is that having Christianity has been a very significant positive for this country. And our secular friends, I think, are kidding themselves if they think getting rid of religion is going to make for a more peaceful society. It actually has created just the opposite as we've looked at what has happened to other countries.
You know, I think that's exactly right. One of the things I do early in that book, the follow-up book, is I cite some of these really big books that have come out recently. Rodney Stark, The Victory of Reason,
Yes.
Tom Holland, Dominion, Larry Seidentop, The Invention of the Individual. Now, some of these people are Christians. Some of them aren't. Tom Holland mentions, well, I was kind of raised in Anglican Sunday school, but I'm not a Christian anymore. But then he goes on to demonstrate in spades how Christianity has impacted Western civilization in incredibly positive ways. And so I just kind of follow up on that argument, just focusing on America, and to make exactly the point you just made, that if you look at all of the reform movements that we now look back on and say, yeah, that was a really good thing, they were led by Christians. The foot soldiers were Christians. Christians have been intimately involved in almost all the important social and political reform movements throughout American history up to the present day.
Let me just mention before I let you go that because people have probably appreciated what they've heard today, they might be thinking, well, is it possible to have him come and speak to our group, perhaps get some of the resources? We do have a link at your website, markdavidhall.org. You have your books, you have all the endorsements, you have some of the media that you have done and resources. But if people might want to have you come and address some of these issues, would that be a possibility?
Absolutely. I am actually looking forward to doing that. In 2026, America's 250th anniversary. I already have a number of speaking events lined up, but I'd love to do more. I love speaking about this stuff. I think it's important. It's important as a matter of history, but you also mentioned the so what question. I think there are important practical reasons why we need to recognize the Christian influence in our history and how this influence might motivate us to be engaged today. Again, to seek the prosperity of all people, the flourishing of all people, Christians and non-Christians alike.
Well, and again, you mentioned just a few individuals like Tom Holland and Rodney Stark and others, all of who have been on the program with us. Rodney Stark no longer alive. Tom Holland, I've heard he's reconsidering his rejection of Christianity, so we'll have to see how that all plays out. But it's a good illustration of the fact that a lot of things are coming our direction. And during this 250th anniversary of this country, we wanted to provide people with some resources. And again, I'll hold up some of the booklets that we have on One Nation Under God or Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, Church State, Patriot Preachers. This is how you can learn about these issues. This is how you can pass this on to your children and on to your grandchildren. So, Mark David Hall, it was great to meet you. It's hard to believe that was 6 years ago in studio. But again, I've certainly been impressed with all the things you've done since then. And I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, again, the book is entitled, one more time, Did America Have a Christian Founding? We focused most of our time and attention on that, but I might also mention his other book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land. And, of course, he has a number of other books that you can find out about. So go to the website, pointofview.net. If you say, okay, I would like to read that book, it is fairly readable. As a matter of fact, I think anybody could make their way through it and certainly benefit from that. We have information about that on our website at pointofview.net. You can get it in hardcover, paperback, or Kindle. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.